Today, my guest Dr. Julie Lopez and I discuss implicit memory, understanding our brain's hidden control panel and the many possibilities of breaking through our unconscious roadblocks. Dr. Julie is a trauma specialist who founded a mental health and wellness center in Washington, D.C. called the Viva Center, and her recent book, Live Empowered, was named a hot new release in 10 book categories. I found this conversation really eye-opening, so I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to Journey to Authenticity. My name is Sarah Hart. Join me in the quest to uncover our true self and make aligned choices with relationships, purpose, spirituality, and body-mind. Together with my guests, we share the stories, practices, and perspectives on how we can all live an authentic life. Remove the mask, reveal the real you, and spread your light. So, Dr. Julie Lopez, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Sarah.
And I just said to you before we started recording that I've got this fascination with implicit memory. And I heard you speaking on an interview on a Doctors On, and you were talking on that very subject. And I just thought, wow, I've got to speak to you. I've got to get you on the show. So thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here. And that makes two of us that are fascinated with the subject of implicit memory.
Yeah, this sort of endless pool of depth that we could go into, I'm sure, with it. But I think first of all, just for the context of the conversation, it would just be great if you could just describe the differences, first of all, between explicit and implicit memory.
Yeah, absolutely. So explicit memory is the memory that we can consciously recall. Implicit memory is the memory that we cannot consciously recall, but is stored in our system and influences our behavior, our decisions, and plays a major role in what we move towards or avoid in our life. You can think of it like energetic imprints that are in our system. I actually like to use a metaphor that I coined around a hidden control panel. It's like this part of the brain that no matter how much you think or analyze, you can't access in that way. But the good news is, and I'm sure we'll get to it later on in the podcast, is that there are many ways to access it and actually change it for the better.
Yeah, I mean, this hidden control panel I'm really fascinated with. So what are the sort of memories or experiences, I'm sure you're talking about this very early childhood part really, that go into programming that hidden control panel?
So I've been told many times when I'm not in a clinical audience to try to keep this part brief, but I'll say this.
Go for it.
Everything that goes into implicit memory is a result of the hippocampus, which is a part of our limbic system in the brain. And when I'm doing one of my talks, I actually put a picture of a hippo and then like tents and people in a camp, and then a group of people like us, so people can remember hippocampus. But there are 4 reasons that data goes into implicit memory. And like you spoke about, one of them is before the age of 36 months, all of data goes into implicit memory because the hippocampus is not fully formed. So that's one of them. The other is if you have a brain injury where the hippocampus is injured, then data starts going into implicit memory only because the hippocampus is responsible for putting a date and time stamp on an experience and then storing it in explicit memory. If we're particularly stressed out, I live in Washington, D.C., and this is the land of overachievers and high ambition. And so a lot of people are stressed. And when you're stressed out, the hippocampus shuts off. And so sometimes parts of the data can go into implicit memory, which is very fascinating. And then the fourth one is if you're actually in a traumatic experience and you dissociate from what's going on, a lot of times parts of the material will go into implicit memory. I don't know if that's more than you wanted to know, but that's the Cliff Note version, because believe me, our brains are complex.
No, that's absolutely perfect. And then I suppose what I'm really interested in is to know that of those sorts of memories, what are the types of experiences that create the actual roadblocks as you describe them in our life later? How can they sort of show up?
So the beautiful thing about this life that we're living is that our bodies are designed to take care of us always. They're designed to adapt and adjust to any of the curveballs that life throws at us. And they're designed to improve. And our bodies, and when I say bodies, I mean our whole human system, do this without our consent, right? You get a cut on your hand and a scab will form. You didn't tell it to do any of those things, but there are commands, right, in this very complicated control panel that runs our lives that are telling our hearts to pump, right? And our lungs to take in oxygen and many, many other different types of directives. So when we have situations, I'll just use, like I said, there are 4 different ways this can happen with the implicit memory. But sometimes things that we know the obvious roadblocks. If you want to swim across the pool and you don't know how, right, then you have a conscious and like very obvious roadblock that you haven't been taught how to swim, right? And so you take your lessons and you learn how to do this and you grow your confidence and you are able to accomplish what you want, right? I'm talking about the times where you're physically able to do something, you want something, you're motivated to do something, and yet despite all effort and intelligence and intention and ability, it doesn't happen. And so what are these types of things? You know, it's asking for a raise at work for some people. It's speaking in front of a large group. It's being able to tolerate vulnerability in a relationship. It's, you know, I could go on and on. People have all kinds of goals. We can get into, I work with a lot of business people. So they have management goals or sales goals or, you know, new systems to implement, and they know all about it, but have these roadblocks to making it happen. And so when it defies logic, and we all have those things. Oh, I need to lose 20 pounds. I've read, I am an expert, right, in nutrition and weight loss and exercise. I know how to change my metabolic rate because I know the science behind it. But implementing, it's not happening, right? And so when those things happen, 100% of the time, it's because there's other data stored in implicit memory. So let me say, because I just used that example about nutrition and weight loss, I'll just start there. So let's say we have someone that falls into that category. And let's just say, to illustrate the point, that when they were a little one, things weren't safe at home. And, you know, watched people in their family be hurt or watched violence. And their system, because it's brilliant, thought, you know, how am I going to be safe? I'm going to be invisible and I'm going to keep things around me. And these codes, which I think of as like pathways, right? They're little connectors in the brains with the neurons and the synapses. They say, not in the conscious brain, but in the implicit memory, keep a barrier between yourself and other people. And so maybe for this person, what's stored in their implicit memory is that the weight itself is a safety from being hurt or offer some protection from the violence they're seeing around them. They didn't consciously make this choice, but this is a strategy that they're using. And so to get into the more hopeful part of the discussion, which I think is super cool, is that in the last 30 years, we've had a ton of advancement in terms of understanding the way the mind and the body connect together. And that without words, because implicit memory does not speak the language of intellect or logic, we can reprogram some of those codes. Because that very same guy that I'm talking about in the example might not consciously even know there's that type of code in his brain, right? And we don't need to know the code in order to move it to a more adaptive message, right? And a more adaptive message might be, and not, this is very hard for people to follow, not intellectually, but in his body. Oh, right. I'm 55 years old now. This violence that I might have seen when I was little isn't alive and well anymore. And I don't need all this padding on me to actually be safe within my system. And we can do that through brain and body based therapies and expressive therapies. And actually, I had a book that came out about 4 months ago, earlier this year. And in the back of that book, there's a large appendix that's like 4 pages long and has web references, but anything that's nonverbal can actually be used to access this material and to shift it. Obviously better with someone who's trained to do the work, because we ourselves can't shift this or even see it. It always takes another person to move it through. But actually, I mean, just to say, I outline, there's something I do in workshops where I help people start to identify what's in their implicit memory. And that's also outlined in the book. It does, the 4th step does involve another person, but it doesn't have to be a big, expensive kind of therapeutic investment. Sarah, don't get me started or I'll just keep talking.
Well, no, I will say, let's go down a little bit soon about the sort of different options and therapeutic things that you offer. And I think just to kind of sum that little bit up, there's a Peter Levine quote, and I don't know whether this was something through you that I had read, but he said that you don't have to know the facts of your story to be able to reprogram the symptoms or outcomes. And I think that was like really just sort of summed it up. So if you don't have,
I love it.
The whole point is you don't have the logic and the language, as you said. And in my own experience, that a really powerful part of my own healing journey has been to come out of my mind and come into my body through, I've used methods like holotropic breath work. I don't know if
Yeah.
And I was all touching on this. And now it's great because when I started listening to you, it started to bring words and language to the experience that I'd had. But I couldn't have had the language first.
Yes. And that language, which is really even the language I'm using right now, is helpful for framing the experience and to be able to communicate it to others. But it would not be effective at actually doing the work, which is really interesting. It's a very hard concept for people to digest and kind of sit with. Yeah. So Peter Levine did say that, but interestingly enough, the week after my book came out, he and I were on a video call, and I quoted it in my book, and then I wrote it on one of my Instagram tiles or something like that.
Must have been
and and then I told him, I said, you said this thing and it was so powerful, and he was like, I did. Oh, okay. I was like, yeah, it was on a podcast, and you know what I mean. So it was something that I found, and he just spouted out, but it was really powerfully said, and I love it.
I am interested to hear from the point of view of the adoption experience, though, how you, your experience or working with other people, ways that this implicit memory can show up in adult life for them that could be associated with their adoption and maybe had never even thought that it could be.
Yes. So, I am an adopted person, and I was adopted when I was 2 months old. So the first 2 months of my life, I know I was in an orphanage with about 20 other babies. And so there are things that have impacted me in my life that were stored in my implicit memory and that I treated mostly with one of the brain-based therapies that I do now. Although I would say I do feel like I've had some pretty powerful experiences with trauma sensitive yoga and therapeutic yoga, which have been really transformative, and internal family systems work and some constellations work. I've had a lot of therapy.
I've done a few of those.
Let's just say that. But all of them, I think the thing for me that was really helpful was that they were all using nonverbal methods that helped me access things that I wasn't even consciously aware of, yet I was struggling with the symptoms that corresponded to them. And so a big piece of my fascination with the work is because of my early experiences. And like I already told you, stuff that happens before the age of 3 years old gets stored automatically in implicit memory. So it's been a real motivator for me. Adopted people don't all have that same experience. Some are adopted when they're 4 or 5 or have conscious memory of their families. But, adoption is something that happens when someone is in a very distressing situation, whether it's emotional or physical or financial. Usually a baby isn't relinquished unless there's some significant stressor on the family. And so, there's a pretty high correlation with struggles that originate from implicit memory with adoptee struggles. I have found being active in my, adoptee community. So,
what sort of symptoms do they experience in adult life?
Well, I'll tell you mine first, like the struggles, and everyone's different. But I can say that first of all, in my early 20s, I got vertigo. So it became really crippling, and I couldn't walk my normal route to work because I took the metro, and this metro, which is our little train system in DC, my stop had a very, very tall escalator, and I could not take it. I'd have to sit and wait for the elevator because I just constantly felt like I was going to tumble down. And I know that a number of my fellow adoptees struggle with stuff like that, like feeling like you're falling or feeling disoriented. And I will say that symptom that for some is debilitating for years, I cleared up within 2 weeks with one longer session of one of the brain-based therapies. So that was pretty awesome. Relationship struggles, I'm definitely still, kind of a lone ranger. I mean, I'm married with 4 kids and 2 dogs and a fish named Beyonce, but whatever. but I like my independence probably to a fault. And so I think for a lot of us adoptees unconsciously, we might kind of sabotage relationships because it feels scary to be really vulnerable with someone, even if it's not conscious. I mean, some people are more conscious of it than others. And some people work really hard to be in relationships, yet they're actually participating in sabotaging types of behaviors without realizing it, pushing people away or testing them. So that's pretty common. I can say there was a client that I worked with. I work with a number of adoptee clients, and he was struggling with OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder. His struggle had to do with his clothing and his shoes, like being in some type of order that he himself just arbitrarily decided, and he would arrange and rearrange things and kind of straighten them and try to just constantly put things in order. Again, this is a wild concept to grasp because we're not having an intellectual conversation to figure out what the roots are. Just like that Peter Levine quote, it's unnecessary. I'm just interested in outcomes. And so we did some of this rewiring, and, I think his thoughts on it in retrospect, theoretically, were that, yeah, maybe things were pretty out of order. He was a transracial adoptee, great family he was adopted into, which isn't always the case, but it was, and he'd had a pretty good life. And when I worked with him, he was on a break from university because this OCD was totally debilitating him and totally getting in the way of his ability to function. And the important thing was that it stopped doing that.
Yeah,
because regardless of the analytics, I mean, the analytics are more about control and maybe about the therapist trying to feel like they're solving the puzzle. When in reality, my experience with some of these nonverbal therapies is there's a supreme trust in our system to unknot the knots, right? And so you get into the physical sensation and you move it into something that's more adaptive that usually the person already knows intellectually. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's
so I know you asked for a few examples of adoptees, but I would just say this as someone who's invested, like many of my fellow adoptees are, in elevating the adopted person's voice so that their story is heard. It's pretty diverse. I just shared a couple of my struggles and then one client struggle. I could share others. Like I said, I've worked with a lot of adoptee clients. And so, there's all kinds of stuff. It depends on what happened from 0 to 3 and what kinds of experiences their system had. And for babies and infants and toddlers, a lot of the way they take in data is through their senses. It's all sensory. It's not so explicit like we're talking about.
So let's go into some of the ways then that we can hack this control panel.
Yeah. So there's so many. Had you seen that chart in the back of my book or
no,
not?
I haven't.
Okay. So one of my favorites I'll start with, which is the first one I share, and I share it because it's free. So I share it first. Okay. And what it is it's a huge resource library repository that's action oriented. It's called the Resilient Brain Project, which is www.resilientbrainproject.com. And in it, you can search by struggle area or mental health area. There are 12 different areas. And what they are, in every category, there's a section called Actions for Now. And all of those actions are nonverbal actions. So it might be like a connection to an app, right? An app that's going to help you with your breath work, right? Mm-hmm. And going to guide you through some of these things that can shift the way that your nervous system is operating. Or it's a blog that talks about steps 1 through 5. There's things to try. They're not academic papers. They're things like right now to shift your body's state. And so I love that. There's other resources on there too, but I put it there for that reason, because it was designed to help people, like from the comfort of their home and the privacy of their own space, to start to dip their toe into this huge pool of how amazing our bodies are and how we can move them and start to introduce them that way. So that's the first thing. But I mostly categorize it in terms of brain and body work. So some of the brain-based therapies are neurofeedback, EMDR, brain spotting, body-based. You mentioned Peter Levine. So he founded somatic experiencing. There's sensory motor psychotherapy. There are a number of body-based therapies, and then expressive therapies, anything where you're not using words. So even canine therapy or equine therapy. I mentioned trauma-sensitive yoga, especially therapeutic yoga, where it's a trained mental health professional who also understands the way these different aspects of the human system come together. They can actually work with you in a more pinpointed way than a traditional yoga class where they're there to lead a practice, and you may have experiences come up, but they're not really trained on how to capture them and move them through your system. Those are a few. The list isn't extensive. I mean, isn't all inclusive, but it's pretty extensive with web references as well. So there are links to kind of click on and go and research more. The whole book, I mean, it's called Live Empowered because it's designed to empower people with this invisible part, this hidden part of our human system, and then start to give real examples, empowering people with the science behind it, and then ways to move it. I would also say, a few chapters before that table, I do talk about this methodology called the PACT methodology. It's a 4-part process. I mentioned it earlier about workshops that I do where you need one other trusted person to do it, but it actually walks through these different charts where you start with identifying a pain point, like the roadblocks or the things you're like, I've tried so long, or it's been so many years, or I've been like, I know all about this in therapy. I've talked it, till I'm blue in the face, but I'm not shifting the way I feel or the way or the probability that I'll take the actions that I know will lead to success. It's like identifying that and then breaking it down into these different sections. So it's PACT, P-A-C-T. So pain point, and then you have associations. So there's an exercise that walks you through all the associations with that on all these different levels. And then you categorize those. So there's a table where it actually even prompts you more to think about, like, how am I holding this in my body? What happens when this is going on? That type of thing. And then here's the part that's always hard for people is the T stands for trust. And so getting the trusted person to look at your chart and to listen as like a humble student, right? While the trusted friend is sharing what they see as like a compassionate and curious advisor. right? Because when someone says, ooh, look at all this stuff, it seems like somewhere in your system, I know you said you want to be in relationships, but it seems like you're afraid of them. You're like, I'm not afraid of relationships. I go on dates all the time, right? It's like, it's going to literally be outside of your consciousness. I actually just worked with a client today. And for her struggles stem from some intergenerational trauma. She's a 3rd generation Holocaust survivor, and she was reading a book to understand kind of her struggles with eating, and some of her emotional eating. And she's like, I just can't get to the emotion. They keep telling me there's emotion under it. And all she could get to was a mood, was just that she'd feel anxious. And it took a while and some guidance and a lot of like checking in with the body, but the feelings were not from her own conscious experience and her own conscious life. They were things that she could trace back more in hindsight or theoretically to things her grandparents and parents might have passed on energetically because this terrible trauma had happened in their history.
Yeah.
So it gets really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that can be really out there for some people, but I think it makes it makes sense, but also just energetically, when you've done something like constellation work and you see that play out, it's like, wow.
I can make it more concrete for your listeners though.
Okay. Go for it
if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So picture it. Just in that example, I was talking about the Holocaust. So let's pretend, okay, my name's Julie and I escape with none of my family. And I was like, humiliated and tortured and every other thing. And my very protected, educated, affluent life crumbled in a day. And it was like a horrible, terrible thing. And then I, moved I live in the States, so I moved to America. And then I have my little children, but I'm so, so traumatized and full of loss. And so what happens for me, and this is real, I've worked with many, multi-generational Holocaust survivors. I keep a whole separate room full of food. I have a secret room in case this happens to us and our family. I never let my children out of my sight. Like I hide the fact that I'm Jewish or da-da-da-da. And that energetically passes on to the kids. It's not like stuff is just in your cells and it goes down. It's that I'm, let's say, Sarah, you're my child and you're growing up with me and you're like, the world is a scary place and bad things happen. And I have to be careful and protect myself and guard food and be ready to run in a moment's notice and have a secret place. And just, those are more concrete. So it's not that I've lived through what you've lived. Yeah.
It's making total sense. And I've actually just had a big aha moment here because my adopted mother is Jewish and her father was a Holocaust survivor and her grandmother died in Auschwitz. And my mum, so she's the next generation, has always stored food in our house. Like when there's an outbreak of something like swine flu, she'll get all these medications and then she'll fill cupboards with food. So maybe that's energetically carried to her too.
Of course. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible thing that people lived through. It's like a very, real and significant stressor. And that's just a example that everyone can relate to because they know how horrible the Holocaust was. But, you could name any other type of trauma that happens. I mean, a massive problem in our country that's very dark moments in our history was slavery. Can you imagine going over to Africa and just taking people? People jump from ships to escape being in chains like animals and, just terrible, horrible things that happened. And and then that energetically passes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good example because I think then you're seeing it without the healing of that trauma that's been carried through. You see it played out unconsciously again and again until the healing takes place. But there's so many things you've just sort of touched on there, so many things. But I think that the big takeaways is to kind of go, the implicit memory is playing out usually when it defies logic. And in terms of healing, that there's so many options out there. I think everybody should get your book. It's called Live Empowered, right?
Thanks. Yeah, it's called Live Empowered. Rewired your implicit memory to rewire your brain's implicit memory to thrive in business, love, and life. Yeah, but the main thing is that hey, and the big thing is about that not everyone that you talk to understands this part of our human system. Some people do and some people don't. So as a consumer, if you're thinking about investing in some type of therapy, just say, hey, how do you work with implicit memory? And if they're like, oh, what's implicit memory? Then that's not your person. You know what I'm saying? And so we become empowered when we start to understand these different layers of how our systems work. And there are people, like I said, it's been about 30 years of really exciting advancements in understanding how to make very real difference. And when we're having these experiences, yes, that defy logic, that you're just baffled about why you can't seem to be successful, or a friend, you know, we're the best at seeing kind of like what a friend is struggling with. And that's why that T in the PACT methodology is there, because they're going to say, well, I hate to tell her, but you know, she does this all the time. Right. And you say, no, I don't. It's very hard to take that in and be aware that, oh yeah, maybe there is a part of me, not one that I'm consciously connected to, that feels that. And I'll say for the client I spoke about, where she's trying to look at some of her emotional eating issues, you know, part of her felt kind of worthless and fearful when we did the exercises and we were kind of going deeper. She's like, but I don't know why I would feel that, because in her life, that hadn't been her reality. And she's a very confident and successful attorney. You know, she's like, I do all these things in front of people. It wasn't that. Deeper implicit memory.
That's it.
Yeah.
And it's the blind spots, like you just said. We're not going to be able to see it or articulate it, the language, because it's in the blind spot.
Yeah.
And that's really good advice, almost like interview the therapist, because to know if they know about implicit memory. And from everything you've just said, it isn't traditional talk therapy that's going to solve it anyhow. So looking at all of these other options of energetic or body-based therapies or brain wiring therapies. I'm going to put a link to that website that you said in the show notes, and to your website as well. So people can read more about it. And then that other part that you said also about another person being involved, because they're the parts that we can do ourselves, and we can start to do some of these exercises as you described, or doing some breath work at home, but having that third person that has the deeper understanding, can hold space to create that kind of window of safety for you to go to a deeper experience is really key.
Well, and don't get me wrong. I mean, I can say, I mean, I'm a mildly successful person, I would say, in my community and in my life, but a lot of it I personally attribute to my own work and being introduced to these types of ways of working, because it's one thing to analyze something and understand it logically. It's a whole different thing to be free from what can feel like chains that are holding you back. And I attribute a lot of my personal and professional successes to having some of those therapeutic approaches being done with me. And actually in my last chapter of the book, I do talk very specifically about what I would advise someone if I was talking to you on the phone, or you're my friend and we're talking on a coffee shop, like what type of questions you should ask to make sure you're investing your time and your money and your energy into the right person to guide you through that. Because it's amazing how powerful some of these things can be in one session. It's as easy as that. I could tell you so many stories. Like there are stories coming to mind, especially because you asked about adoptees, but that are amazing. Actually, I'm going to highlight one thing, which is, I don't know if you know who Gabor Mate is.
I do. I love him. I love his
He's
work.
amazing. Well, he wrote the front cover blurb for my book.
Saw. That's awesome.
It's pretty awesome, right?
Yeah.
But he did it because one of his books on the stress disease connection, he felt really strongly about more people understanding how implicit memory is oftentimes, if not all the time, responsible for some of these major illnesses that are stress related. And by stress, I don't mean stress like, oh, I have a high stress job, or oh, da da da. I mean stress in your body, right?
Yeah,
and
like hormonally driven.
Hormones, stressors can be things that you eat that are inflaming your system. But because I'm a mental health practitioner, I've got an amazing story of a woman who came in for some anxiety stuff. We didn't work longer than 3 months together, adult adoptee. And just to cut the whole story short, met all her treatment goals, which is awesome, really lowered her anxiety level that she was feeling on a daily basis. It was just her norm, right? Like a fish in water doesn't know what water is because there's never been anything different. When we finished the treatment, a side consequence of that work was that her psoriasis, which is an inflammatory skin condition that she had been fighting for 35 years with a dermatologist, medications, abatement from time to time, but it always came back, disappeared.
That's incredible. Yeah.
Because her system wasn't all jacked up all the time, like waiting for something terrible to happen. It was awesome. And that's power. That is power.
Absolutely.
Talk about being empowered, right?
Huge. Really, really powerful. I think we're going to have you back on the show at another time.
Good. Good. I'd love to do that.
I think that's really wonderful. But I think the optimistic part, as you said, is that we can hack this control panel. You can change the codes. You can live an empowered life. There are ways that you can overcome. And I think that's really wonderful. So I'd just like to ask you one last question before we kind of come to the close. Which I like to ask all of my guests was, what's your definition of a journey to authenticity?
Definition. So a journey to authenticity for me as a trauma specialist is someone getting to their core of who they were meant to be. And ideally it's that life examined where we're walking in our truth of what we're uniquely talented to do and what we're particularly motivated and enjoy doing so that we can give back to one another.
That's beautiful. That's wonderful. Thank you
you
so much. I just want to finish by just acknowledging you for, I think for your dedication and your passion to this work of trauma. And I think it could be really hard to find the help that's needed when you don't have words to describe it. And so I think what you're doing is just really, really powerful in healing, and especially for the adoption community as well, for them that don't really have so much of a voice, that you're giving them a voice in that. So I thank you and appreciate you for what you're doing.
Oh, thanks so much, Sarah. And to you, look at you being a light in the community to support people to be their best selves. So it's a mutual admiration society.
I hope that this episode has helped you gain new insights in your quest to discover more of who you are. If you want to stay connected, then head to journeytooauthenticity.co.uk and subscribe. I'd love to hear some of your takeaways. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.